Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marissa Barrera. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and ella. I'm a social worker with the Children's Immigration Law Academy, or better known as CILA. Before we get started, please say hello in the chat. Tell us your name of your organization, and what part of the US or the world are you joining us from? Okay. This will be our agenda for today, but let me expand on this a bit. We'll be covering pre-migration challenges, post-migration challenges, one-on-one LGBTQI knowledge and best practices. We'll have time to answer questions at the end as well. Before moving on with the presentation, I would like to discuss some housekeeping matters. This is going to be an 1.5 hour long webinar. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. We'll have some time at the end for questions, but if for some reason we're not able to answer your question here, we'll provide that answer by email at a later time. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted on our website at a later time as well. We will be providing a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and some resources for all of you. Following the webinar, we will be providing a survey for feedback. Please take time to complete that. This will help us identify areas of improvement, know what we are doing right, or ideas for future trainings and webinars. Also, if you need a letter of attendance, we'll be providing a link form to request that at the end as well. Some of you are familiar with CILA's work, but for those who are not, let me tell you a little bit about CILA. We are a project of the American Bar Association Commission of Immigration located in Houston, Texas. We are a legal and social service resource center. We are a capacity building organization, and here at CILA, we believe that every child should have representation. CILA provides technical assistance regarding case-specific questions relating to children and youth with immigration cases here in Texas and to the National Barrera Network. We provide training and written resources as well. We currently offer 6 working groups. Our Pro Bono working group has been national for some time, and several of our other working groups are going to go national as well, including one focus on special immigration juvenile status, one focus on asylum for unaccompanied children, and another center on working with detained children. Our social service working group remains Texas focused for now, but we hope to expand it to a national audience in the future. Via our working groups, we want to provide space for advocates to collaborate and support each other. We want to make this an interactive webinar as much as we can, not a lecture. This means we want to hear from you. We want to hear about your knowledge, experience, and about the challenges you have encountered while advocating for LGBTQI clients. Your voice matters, and we want to hear from you. Please join us by participating by answering the following icebreaker questions via Slido. You can go to slido.com and use 2619537 or scan the following QR code in front of you by using your phone or tablet. And please keep your Slido page open after this set of questions, as we'll be using it later in the presentation as well. I'll give you guys, everybody, a minute or two to get ready. Hopefully everybody's able to log on. Okay. Hopefully everybody got there, and we'll move to our questions. This is going to be more of a history and 101. Do you know why June was chosen as Pride Month? I'll give you guys a few seconds to answer that, and I'll provide the answer in a bit. Okay, I see. I'm looking at the number and I see the number still going, so I want to give everybody a chance to answer, and then we'll move on. Okay, welcome. Yes, the answer is because it is when the Stonewall riots took place back in 1969. But let me share some history on this. The Stonewall riot was also known as the Stonewall Uprising. This raid was the culmination of a long history of abuse, discrimination, and harassment by law enforcement and others. This helped spark the riot that would serve as the catalyst for the gay rights movement in the United States and around the world. Our next question, what was Sylvia Rivera known for? Again, I'll give you guys some time to answer that question. I meant to say, I want to give everyone a chance to answer that question. Okay. Yes, it was all of the above. She fought not only for gay and trans rights, but also racial, economic, and criminal justice issues. She's known for participating in the Stonewall riots as well. She's also the co-founder for the Gay Liberation Front and for establishing the political organization STAR. We'll move on to the next question. Who were involved in the creation of the rainbow flag? Okay, I see the number still rising, so I want to let everybody answer their question. Okay. Yes, both Harvey Milk and Gilbert Baker. Let me give you a little bit of history on that as well. The rainbow flag was created in 1978 by artist, designer, Vietnam War veteran, and then drag performer Gilbert Baker. He was commissioned to create the flag by another gay icon, politician Harvey Milk. The color signifies red for life, orange for healing, yellow signifying sunlight, green for nature, blue for harmony, and purple for spirit. What does the Q stand for in LGBTQI? I'll give everyone a chance to answer that as well. Okay. If you answer both question and queer, both of you are, or you are correct. It's both, but our guest speaker will be giving us a 101 on terminology later in the presentation. Sexual orientation and gender identity mean the same thing. True or false? Okay. It is false, but our guest speaker, as I mentioned earlier, she's going to be expanding and discussing more of this later in the presentation. The US ranks in the top 10 safest countries for LGBTQI for the LGBTI communities. True or false? Top 10. Okay, and that is false. The US actually ranks 24th. This is due to the fact that some states don't offer protections against discrimination or allow for change of gender. The top 10 countries are Canada, Sweden, Netherlands, Portugal, United Kingdom, Belgium, Norway, Spain, and France. Okay, so keep your Slido window open. We're gonna be using it later on. But let's move on. Why this webinar? We want to bring awareness to the challenges LGBTQI youth face with an emphasis on unaccompanied youth. We deemed it appropriate to host this webinar this month because June is Pride Month here in the US and around the world. Pride Month is when the world's LGBTQI communities and their allies come together to celebrate the freedom to be themselves and to bring awareness to current issues facing the community. Even though we're in a better place now, injustices and negative attitudes still remain here in the US and around the world. This is especially true in Latin America, where tradition-based beliefs discriminate against anyone who's gender diverse or who's not heterosexual. We know that unaccompanied youth migrate to this country for various reasons. For some, one reason is to escape the stigmatization, discrimination, abuse based solely on their sexual orientation or gender identity. So the work is not over. Through the continuation of education and awareness, we can get a little bit closer to inclusiveness for all. This webinar is for all who seek to support the overall well-being of LGBTQI in general, but in particular, unaccompanied youth. Thank you all for choosing to be here. Country conditions for Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. What do we know about life for the LGBTQI communities in these countries? We know that the environment in their home country is not conducive for healthy physical and emotional growth. This hindering them from reaching and realizing their fullest potential. I know hearing this is not going to surprise anyone here. Many of you have heard the stories and read some news headlines out there. However, I still want to provide you with some recent and current data in regards to current conditions for the LGBTQI communities in those countries. According to the Human Rights Report released in 2020, the governments of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras have failed to effectively address the violence and the entrenched discrimination against anyone who's gender diverse or who's not heterosexual. Human Rights Watch has indicated that Honduras, by some estimates, has the highest rates of murders of transgender people in the world. Other forms of violence against trans people are also common, not only in Honduras, but El Salvador and Guatemala. According to the country reports released by the United States Department of State, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, 15,000 children in Honduras were homeless and living on the streets, primarily in major cities. These children are homeless for various reasons, but for countless, this is due to the discrimination, abuse they have experienced by their own families based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. The commercial sexual exploitation of children, especially in sex trafficking cases, continue to be a problem in Honduras, in particular with displaced, vulnerable children. And as I previously mentioned, many of these displaced youth are LGBTQI youth. It's not surprised that they rarely report abuse or exploitation to authorities due to the abuse and the discrimination they have experienced by government authorities themselves, including law enforcement. Some youth have recounted incidents in which state security agents beat them, demanded sex from them, humiliated them, discriminated against them, or harassed them because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. In all three countries, violence against LGBTQI people is rarely investigated or prosecuted, in the vast majority of cases in impunity. And this is by the people that were supposed to protect them in the first place. We do not have data on how many unaccompanied youth identified as LGBTQI here in the US, but we do know that countless have traveled to the US to escape the abuse, discrimination, and stigmatization solely on their sexual orientation or gender identity. They leave because they're not receiving the protection and support they need from their country, communities, and many times from their own families. The journey to the US for many of these youth is viewed as a journey of hope, for the hope of finding a place and community that loves and accepts them for who they are. According to the Human Rights Watch, LGBTQI youth have and continue to face abuse, discrimination, marginalization, and stigmatization in all areas of their lives, often prompting their migration. I want to share some of those findings with you. In their home, they often face family rejection, often causing them to flee their homes. Some are physically and sexually abused, or both by their own families. Some receive beatings with the attackers' intent to convert them into heterosexuals. Often children, sometimes as young as 8, have left their homes either because they were ousted or because they felt they could no longer stay in the abusive environment. Some have experienced violence, abuse in their relationship due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. The Guatemalan Human Rights Ombudsman Person Office has reported intimate partner violence against LGBTQI people, including youth, especially violence against lesbian and bisexual women from former male partners. Some are afraid to step out of their homes due to high risk of abuse, assault, or harassment against them, either by gangs or ordinary people from their own community, or both. These perpetrators justify their assault, abuse, harassment by saying that they're just trying to erase what is not normal. Many drop out of school and are not able to receive an education due to harassment, bullying they have experienced there. No law explicitly prohibits discrimination against LGBTQI students in Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. And the education ministry has no guidelines aimed at preventing bullying based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Some are not able to maintain employment due to discrimination and harassment in their place of employment. LGBTQI rights groups asserted that government agencies and private employers engage in discriminatory hiring practices. Transgender women were particularly vulnerable as they faced employment and education discrimination. Many could find employment only as sex workers, substantially increasing the risk for violence. During my time as a therapist in an OR shelter, I worked with many children and youth. Some of these youth identified as LGBTQIA. I would say 9 out of those children had very difficult stories to share. These stories often of abuse, trauma, discrimination, stigmatization, etc. I want to show you a brief story of one of those youth. The name and other identifying information have been changed for their protection. This is the story of one. At the age of 15, he came out as gay to his family. His family immediately rejected him. They beat him up to change him into a heterosexual, and then he was ousted from their home. With nowhere to go, he lived in the streets where gang members harassed and abused him. He was forced to sell his body for sex. When he could no longer take the abuse, he attempted to escape, but he was caught and almost beaten to death. The hospital's social worker called law enforcement, but as soon as law enforcement found out that Juan is gay, they minimized his attack and left without taking a report. Without anything or anyone left to help him, he decided to take a chance and left towards the US. Juan faced many risks and challenges during his journey, but he made it to the US. What we see here is only an abbreviated part of what Juan really went through. With what I have presented in the slide in front of you, it's enough to see the cruelty and horrible treatment this and other youths have lived through, just because they're perceived as different. And it's no wonder that many of these children are at greater risk for mental health concerns, behavioral issues, drug and alcohol usage, and suicide. Our speaker later on will be expanding more on these challenges in a bit. As I mentioned earlier, we do not know the exact number of how many children with similar stories as Juan are here. I looked for this data and could not find current or accurate numbers, but then I asked myself, Is the number really important? No, at least it should not, because even if it's just one or two, that's too many in my eyes. No child nor person should be subjected to these atrocities. And we're going to be using Slido again. I want to hear from you, from your experience working and navigating issues with this youth. So I'll give you everyone a chance to log into Slido. Again, if you, for some reason, you were kicked out, I'll give you, a minute or so. Okay. Have you worked with children or youth facing similar challenges as one? Okay, many of you. I see the number still increasing. I'll give it a little time to see the accurate answer. So it's a good amount. Most of you have. Thank you for being advocates. What were some of the challenges that they encounter? What were some of the challenges the youth encounter that you were helping? Safety, no family support, not being accepted by family, housing insecurities, fear of coming out, fear of acceptance, rejected, medical access, no medical access, family relationships. So when we see the bigger, the more bolded letters and bigger, those are the most, most of the children that you work with felt discrimination, safety, violence, rejection, family rejection. I'm pretty sure this is not very surprising to many of you. Thank you for sharing. How prepared or knowledgeable did you feel when you were navigating these challenges with them? Not at all. Somewhat. Very okay. Very somewhat. So what I'm seeing the most is somewhat or not at all. Yeah. Limited, not very well prepared. I wanted better strategies for drawing youth out. Very prepared. I want to reach out to other communities, resources. Thank you for sharing. Many of us have not felt prepared, or maybe we felt that we didn't have the right words or the right thing to say or the right way to support. I mean, I don't think there's a maybe right word exactly that would, save them for what they're feeling, but what we can do is be their advocates. Thank you for sharing. What did you wish you knew then that you know now? The lingo. Resources for housing and mental health resources. Take it slowly, don't push. Allyship, lingo, verbiage, resources, more appropriate terminology. I'm more familiar with local resources now, how to relate, listen, state resources, affirming language, mental health resources, resources for mental health language, more community resources, resources to provide medical resources, how high risk for vulnerability they are within an already a vulnerable population, icebreakers, how to approach, understanding preference pronouns. Thank you. We hope that we could provide you with some of that knowledge later on, or at least our next presenter. She's very knowledgeable in the matter. Thank you so much for sharing. What are some of the things we could do to advocate, help, support children, youth in similar situations as one? Have better housing resources, ensure they know they aren't wrong, charlas, ensure they validate feelings, he's not alone, listening is key for sure. These are great. Thank you so much for being an advocate. Thank you so much for sharing. This is great. Thank you. I wish I could read them all, but they're getting smaller and smaller on my screen. I hope everybody could see them. Thank you so much for sharing. And again, thank you so much for being an ally. Thank you. So what's next for Juan or unaccompanied youth in similar situation like Juan? LGBTQI unaccompanied youth, similar like Juan, are extremely vulnerable and at risk for further abuse and discrimination post-reunification. Without our support, this youth's future is grim. While all children, youth need protection from abuse and mistreatment, unaccompanied children or youth are especially at risk as they are a disproportionately vulnerable population. In general, LGBTQI youth born or raised here in the US are facing many adversities. More than 70% of them have reported violence based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. 100% reported verbal harassment at one point. 15% are roughly in the juvenile system, and they make up 40% of the youth homeless population here in the US. Now imagine someone here alone with little to no support that is foreign to life here in the US, where they do not speak the language, where their home and life situation is highly unpredictable and unstable, where they continue to feel as they need to hide even more due to their immigration status. The goal of this webinar is not to make you all experts on LGBTQI matters, but instead is to bring awareness to these challenges, and with the hope that this will spark a want to advocate for them. We also want to expand your knowledge on LGBTQI matters to make you feel a bit more comfortable navigating these challenges with them. It's key to have a trauma-informed and cultural humility approach when working and advocating for these youths. This means having a person-centered approach where we are not the experts, they are. This means having a collaboration, a partnership with them, and having an ongoing self-reflection and education where we seek awareness of our own assumptions and biases that might be contributing to their challenges. We have reached out to the Montrose Center of Houston to advance our knowledge on LGBTQI matters. For a long time now, the Montrose Center has been empowering the Houston LGBTQI community, individuals and their families to live a healthier, more fulfilling lives. Laura Kanter, Youth Service Manager for the Montrose Center, will be talking to us in a bit. Laura has over 20 years of experience as a school counselor, community organizer, and social justice advocate. She earned her master's in social work from UCLA in 1996 and has been involved in activism and advocacy related to immigrants, trans, and LGBTQI youth rights at the local, statewide, and national level. As the manager of the youth service at the Montrose Center, she oversees the Hatch Youth Program, youth outreach, and youth rapid rehousing programs and represents the Montrose Center as an advocate for LGBTQI youth and their families. She's on the statewide multidisciplinary task force to end child sex trafficking and was just appointed to the Houston's Mayor LGBTQI Advisory Board. She will be talking to us about foundational information related to serving LGBTQI plus unaccompanied youth that includes key terminology and concepts, awareness to barriers and challenges faced by the LGBTQI post-migration, and the steps service providers can take to support and protect advocates for LGBTQI unaccompanied youth. And now I'll let Laura talk to us, and I'll hand it to you, Laura. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Marissa, and thank you to all of you. I feel really honored to be here today and talk about this topic. I am really moved by the presentation that Marissa just gave, and I think that it's going to help me. So I may actually go around some of my slides based on what Marissa shared with us. I do want to first just position myself here in this presentation today as a white, non-Hispanic, queer, pansexual, lesbian woman who is the grandchild of Jewish Polish immigrants, and I speak very limited Spanish. With that said, I have done a bit of work in California with queer and transgender immigrant youth and families, and also with transgender immigrant women, some of them in ICE detention in Southern California. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen to get to my presentation, and I'm going to hit this button and hopefully it's going to work. There we go. I have created my presentation with 3 different sections. And so what I'll try to do is to stop at the end of each section to ask some questions. However, please do put your questions in the chat and we will have time to go to those that I miss at the end of the presentation. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity to chat with you. So some of this may be information that you already know, the terms and concepts, but it's a very important place to start so that we have a shared language and understanding about this topic. And I won't read every slide through, but I'll give you the main points. Our understanding about gender and sexuality is constantly evolving, and so is the vocabulary we use. We use the words to talk about who we are and describe ourselves to others. They may not mean the same thing years from now, or even between 2 people who use them. And the plus, when we say LGBTQIA plus, is not just a mathematical symbol anymore, but a denotation of everything on the gender and sexuality spectrum that letters and words can't yet describe. And I think that as I continue to grow and evolve, I find myself more in the plus than in any other of the letters. I want to also set a stage for us here, speaking about all of this through a Western lens, which I also think of as a colonized gender lens, where terms such as transgender and gay are actually new constructs, which assume a couple of things that are social constructs, and those things include that there are only 2 sexes, male or female, as many as 2 sexualities. Some people would say there's only 1, which would be straight, and that there are only 2 genders. And I'll talk about the difference between sex and gender in a moment. Outside of this lens, we can see many more nuanced experiences of human gender and sexuality that expand beyond this binary system. Across the world and for all of recorded history, there are many cultures that recognize, revere, and integrate more than 2 genders, and also recognize more than 2 sexual orientations. And hundreds of distinct societies around the globe have long established traditions for 3rd, 4th, and 5th or more genders. So these are some of those communities. There are the Hijra communities in South Asia, Waria in Southeast Asia, the Fa'afafin in the Pacific Islander communities, Mahu in Native Hawaiian culture, and Two-Spirit people among Native American cultures. Also, the Two-Spirit term is also not a term that would be shared by all Native American cultures. It's really something that is more like an umbrella for the many different ways that many different cultures express and experience sexual orientation and gender identity. In these pictures, the picture of the woman on Vogue, I believe is the Vogue Mexico, and that is a transgender woman on the cover of Vogue Mexico. Here are some images that are from right here in our own backyard, and these are images of India Moore. We have images of trans and non-binary children in these pictures as well. Okay, so something that Marissa had mentioned, and we'll start out with, is that there is a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. Sexual orientation is who a person is attracted to romantically or sexually, or not attracted to. And gender identity is how a person knows themselves to be as it relates to their gender. And on this slide, we also have one version. There are many, many versions of the genderbread person. And sometimes we use a unicorn, sometimes we use a genderbread person. I like this one because it's simple and it goes over these different constructs. So let's start with sex. That's the part where it talks about our bits in between our legs. That's the physical traits, chromosomes, and other physical characteristics that we are born with. And based on that, we are assigned a sex, and following that, we are assigned a gender, which is the rules and roles of the way you're supposed to express your sex. That's how these things are assigned. And what we call that assigned sex at birth or assigned gender at birth. So baby is born, the doctor takes a look. Well, this actually happens before the baby's born because we have all this gender reveal. And they assign a gender/sex at the time of birth. That is sex. The identity, that's up in the brain part, that is how a person knows themselves to be in terms of their gender. So how they experience their gender, that's what they know themselves to be. That can be either in alignment with that sex that was assigned at birth, or it may be different, and we'll talk more about that. And then expression is the way that we express ourselves in terms of our gender identity. And then attraction is how we feel attracted to others, whether romantically or physically, and that's our sexual orientation. We're going to come back to the genderbread person as we move along. I want to also talk to you about this term intersex and what it means and who intersex people are and how it fits into all of this. So some babies, about 1%, are born with what are called intersex conditions, which means that those visible aspects of what creates the sex assigned at birth, whether it's a penis or a vulva, are not always visible and identifiable. And they may not be noticed until puberty. So when a baby is born intersex, there may be some unrelated medical procedures that this child undergoes in order to make it fit better with one of our two binary sexes that we have to assign at birth based on a birth certificate, because there is no category on a birth certificate for intersex. They have to be assigned male or female. And that's really based up to the doctor and the parents. Unfortunately, sometimes these medical procedures are done on babies. And then as they are growing up, those secondary sex characteristics develop and that don't match, and also their gender identity doesn't match with what the parents and doctor assigned to them at birth. So it's important to know intersex is not it's not someone who's transgender. An intersex person is born with intersex conditions, and they are always assigned one of those two genders when they are born, of male or female. There's another word that I think just deserves a little definition, and that's the word queer, or the Q. Sometimes we also use Q for questioning, but nowadays queer is much more and more used, especially by young people. It's an umbrella term. It can mean something different for different people. Historically, it was a derogatory slur, and if you do talk to older people, sometimes they do not appreciate the term. But it is also an ambiguous term and represents a space for exploring your gender and sexuality outside of cultural norms and rigidly defined labels. It's a space where gender and sexuality can be fluid, ever evolving, and free of stigma or shame. I identify as queer. I have for decades. It's a word that has fit for me where I felt like I haven't fit in any of these boxes. So we're back to the gender bent person. I just want to remind us again. So we're going to start with just the attraction part. That's the little heart. That's how we are attracted to others. And this little picture comes from a survey that was done by the Trevor Project. And they surveyed about 30,000 LGBTQ youth across the country. And one of the questions was, how do you identify in your different, how do you identify your sexual orientation and your gender identity? And in sexual orientation, this is how these youth identified. So we had 45 identifying as gay or lesbian, 33 identify as bisexual, and 21% as something else. And these are so many of these something else terms that youth use to identify themselves. There are many resources that you can use to, and I will provide many for you, that you can use to learn more about all of these different terms. But that just shows us that youth are, and this is of course youth here in America. We're not necessarily talking about immigrant youth, although they could be immigrant youth. And so I'm going to move on, but this is just a picture of the different ways that LGBT young people are identifying themselves. So some of them may be immigrant youth, some of them may not be. And that's what this screen is about. We're back to the gender bent person. So now we're going to talk about the sex and identity part, but mostly the identity part. So as I told you, the baby is born based on their physical traits, whether it's a penis or a vulva. The doctor assigns a sex at birth. And then there are some terms that go along with, and then I said with the brain, I talked about the brain, and then as the child develops, and I'll talk about that in a second, then they start to develop their sense of gender identity, and we'll talk about that next. That's the brain part. Some of those terms for gender identity that we just want to put right out there in front. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression is different from the cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. Not all transgender people share the same gender identity. So some people who are transgender use the term transgender for their gender identity, but there are many others. I'm going to show you a slide on that. Transgendered is not a word, it's not a verb, just like lesbian is not a verb. I am not lesbian. And so we just wanted to point that out. Non-binary, it's also can be an umbrella term for other identities that are not within this binary of male and or female. So this is a person who identifies as neither male or female and sees themselves outside of the gender binary. And like with transgender, not all binary people share the exact same gender identity. Cisgender is a word for someone whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. So cisgender is somebody who is not transgender or non-binary. Cisgender is somebody who was born, doctor looked down, sees a penis, the doctor assigns the sex/gender male, and the child grows up identifying as male, and that person is cisgender. Here are some of the terms that youth in this Trevor Project study, and that was from 2020, used to talk about their gender identity. We have 68% of these youth identified as man-woman. And some of those youth that identify as man, woman may be transgender, but they may just be choosing to just not identify themselves anymore as transgender. If, there's youth who identify as gender queer, gender non-conforming, transgender, and different gender identities. And you can see some of these here. And there's quite a few. I will stop here for 1 second just to state that, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is that I also recognize that when we're talking about this particular population, language is different, and the way that people identify themselves is different. Some do use some of these terms and some use other terms, and I have provided some resources that include some really good glossaries, English to Spanish LGBT glossaries, and we'll talk about that. I really like this picture here. Are you a boy or a girl? This person says no. This is my experience working with youth. This is so many youth right now who just don't identify within the binary at all and consider themselves non-binary, genderqueer, agender, and many of those other terms that I showed you on the screen before. So basically, we're going to talk about transgender identity development. So what happens? So gender expectations and messages bombard us constantly from the moment we're born. I talked earlier about gender reveal parties, and you can see these are all from invitations to gender reveal parties. They're very binary. They're very gendered. They're very much about the rules and roles of what our culture sees as male or female. Wheels if you're a boy, heels if you're a girl. And then all of this bombardment of messages then continues on as youth are growing up through their, through the culture, through their peers, community, media, religion. And we know that these things also play a part in every single culture and in the cultures that we're talking about, especially upbringing, culture, religion, and community play a big role in shaping the rules and roles about gender identity, and also the way that people experience their own gender identity and how people respond when other people come out as different than cisgender or different than the gender they were assigned at birth. So gender identity development, unlike sexual orientation, which really starts to develop later, children begin to express their gender between the ages of 3 and 5. And this is really when they start being in those spaces where they are being exposed to the roles and responsibilities of their assigned genders. This may also be when they start to feel that their assigned gender does not represent who they are. And then especially during adolescence, when youth are starting to experience secondary sex characteristics, their voice is dropping, their breasts are growing, their facial hair is growing, their body is changing. These are the things that can be big triggers for trans and non-binary youth, because these experiences are further distancing them from their understanding of who they are in terms of their gender identity. The term when that becomes clinically significant is gender dysphoria. So this is clinically significant distress when a person's assigned birth gender is not the same as the one with which they identify. When young people or anybody has the support to start a gender transition, this is the process by which some people strive to more closely align their internal knowledge of gender with its outward appearance. Some people socially transition. That could include simply changing their name. It could include changing their pronouns, changing the way they dress, doing their hair differently, maybe wearing makeup. So these are things that are part of social transition. They are not physical, permanent physical changes. Permanent physical changes can include taking hormones, testosterone, puberty blockers, and then further modification through medical interventions. A person doesn't need to do any one of these things to be validated in their own gender identity. If a person says that they are a specific gender identity, then the best practice and the best thing we can do for them is honor who they say that they are. And there's no such thing as being transitioned enough. You don't have to meet a certain number of check marks to earn your gender transition or your gender identity star. That exists because it is who you are, and whatever you choose to do or not to do is up to you. So I'm going to just stop sharing for just a moment to see if there's any questions that I might answer about this. It may take a few minutes. I can look in the Q&A if questions have been answered, but any specific questions about, I'm looking in the Q&A, but if I don't know if people can talk or not, but if you have a question you want to put in the Q&A, I can take a look, or we can hold the questions for a few more minutes. And just for a review, what I've gone over is, obviously this is the kind of the description from our own Western cultural lens of the differences between sexual orientation, which is who we're attracted to romantically and physically, and gender identity, which is based on our understanding of our own gender, regardless of our assigned sex or gender at birth. Those are the things that I've talked about, and I talked a little bit about the development of gender identity. And I didn't say anything really about the development of sexual orientation, which really, like I said, comes later on during pre-adolescence and adolescence, when young people start to, you know, have those hormones and those experiences of attraction, whether physical or romantic. So here's a question. So I'm curious about whether the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is considered to be a perpetuation of the medical. Yes. Yes. Wow. Okay. This is great. So there's a lot of discussion about this diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So the question is, I'm curious, and if it's okay, are you all hearing me? I'm hearing me answer the question. I'll read the question. I'm curious about whether the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is considered to be a perpetration of the medicalization and otheringness of the LGBT community. And I would say yes, it is. And it's really a good point that you're making here, because really, gender dysphoria is really a reaction to the binary constructs that are so limiting and that don't include this more expansive understanding of what gender is. So if we had a culture that saw that gender diversity was a normal and maybe even something special to celebrate, which is the case in many places, then these young people wouldn't have gender dysphoria. And it is really a reaction to a oppressive and binary culture. At the same time, in the way that things are set up now, that diagnosis does help people get some of the resources that they need. But it is similar to many other diagnoses that have been used to stigmatize and other people from this community. That is a very good point, that gender dysphoria, it is a reaction to the culture that doesn't see gender diversity as either something real or something good, and doesn't make room for that gender diversity. Yes, in terms of being HIV positive, I can talk to you a little bit about that at the end when we talk about resources. And if I skip it, please remind me again. What does the A stand for? The A can stand for asexual, and asexual people, that is or it can stand for agender. So asexual is a sexual orientation denoter. That is for somebody who feels that they don't have generally sexual attractions to others. Aromantic is for people who feel they don't have a romantic attractions to others. And agender is somebody who feels, I think agender is more like outside of any gender, no gender. So there's a question about pronouns, which we're going to go to later. Back gender dysphoria, just to see the definition. Absolutely. What's the best way? Yes. Hold on to that question about coming out, rejected by the family. I'll go back to that. Yes. So those other things, we're going to talk about practices in a moment. So I think I'll stop. Those are such good questions. Please hold on to your questions. They're really good. I'm going to go back to the gender dysphoria. So here is that. I'm going to close that. Gender dysphoria, clinically significant distress caused when a person's assigned gender is not the same as the one with which they identify. I hope that helps. And you can, of course, look this up. And I really appreciated the comment question about whether that is also a stigmatizing, othering part of this whole situation. Okay, so we're going to talk about risks and challenges. So obviously, it's really important, right, that we understand that we're talking about youths that have multiple intersecting identities, multiple, not just being an immigrant, not just being queer or trans immigrant. That just can be such a, there are so many parts to each of that, especially the immigrant part, and the age. and what culture and what country they came from, what was their immigration process, how much education have they had, what kind of resources do they have when they are here, what happened to them during their process, what are the cultural beliefs that they have come with and that continue to impact them, what about physical and mental abilities. These are all different parts of identity, all these different intersecting identities that layer and intersect with one another. So we're going to talk a little bit about that so that and I'm going to just start with this. So we talked about rejecting families and understanding that youth can face rejection from families, especially for trans youth, and this is especially so trans and gay and lesbian youth from other cultures can face shaming and rejection for their inability to conform with stereotypes. The statistics about homeless youth is an accurate statistic. When we do work with homeless youth in general, up 25 to 40% of those youth will identify as LGBTQIA, which is a very disproportionate number based on, the number of LGBTQIA in the population itself, which, may be up to 10%. When we're talking about immigrant populations, there is an overrepresentation of young gay males and trans youth representing our youth immigrant population. When unsheltered, just like Marissa was talking about, these youth experience a greater risk for victimization, and that especially can include being sex trafficked and also unsafe sexual practices, substance abuse, and developing mental health issues. These risks are exponentially higher for Black and Latina transgender girls and women, and for migrating young people at every stage in their migration. So I know that Marissa talked about some of this. I want to talk about some of this in terms of treatment and best practices because it's I think it's very significant. So pre-migration, LGBTQ people are dealing with the anticipation of what might happen to them, as well as the things that do, which could include rape, death threats, and torture. And I know Marissa talked about some of this. During migration, there are also many problems that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and all of these things are at increased risk for LGBTQ, especially for trans women. And so during the migration process, and then once in the country or in the middle between the two countries, they are at risk for violence, rape, and murder from police, local populations, and then in the process itself, there's so many issues. That includes a lack of documents with their name and gender marker on them that matches their appearance, failure to declare their gender at the border out of fear, and a lack of government support. During the asylum process, we need to think about the fact that many of these young people have never come out and come from cultures and experiences where coming out and being out equals threats of and experiences of violence and rape and murder. And so they have learned to be more not come out, and that it's not okay to come out. Yet when they're going through the asylum process, if they are choosing to get asylum because of fear of these things, then they're forced to come out, and also often forced to talk about private and traumatizing experiences, and that can often be re-traumatizing. So that's really important to think about, that this, we're talking about somebody for us here, it may be different about coming out, but for many others, this is not something that would be normal for them to come out and to talk about all of these personal stories, especially traumatic ones. And then I know that Marissa made so many good points about what for example, Juan went through. And sadly, many of those things happen right here, and especially depending on the state that you end up in or that you go to. Texas is not a safe place for transgender young people or for LGBT young people. They do face harassment and discrimination in schools, when seeking employment and housing, and in the general public. There are some states where they may have more supports and be safer, but Texas is not a safe place for many of these young people. I'm going to skip this slide and maybe come back to it later. It is a population I did some work with, but I think it is important to recognize that anybody who went through the detention process, especially trans and non-binary folks, may be traumatized by that process for many different reasons. So this slide is about coming out and about the importance of social connectedness vis-a-vis coming out. And for many people, coming out allows for a process of connecting with others. But for some people who are coming here, they may, again, fear coming out. With immigrant youth who are coming who may be LGBT, they also may be avoiding people or those who remind them of the community and the country that they came from, because they fear that they will be stigmatized and discriminated against by those people. But then they fear hanging around with the LGBT community that's here because they fear they're going to be discriminated against because they are a person of color or they don't speak English. So there's a great need to understand all of these varying intersecting issues and help with these cultural and linguistic barriers, and help especially LGBT youth connect with the LGBT community or with others who are safe for them. This is a similar slide talking about pretty much the same thing. Because they come from countries with high levels of anti-LGBTQ stigma, asylum seekers may be less likely than LGBTQ non-asylum seekers to reveal their identity to others. That may contribute to social isolation. They do not necessarily seek support and connections in the same way that other immigrants and refugees may, and they may feel disconnected from the community, again, because of discrimination or language barriers. And I'm also using the words refugee, immigrants, and asylum seekers to kind of talk about this whole large population of people who are coming here who are LGBTQ in various ways, and who often are unaccompanied youth. So what helps? This is my last little section, and I'll talk for just a few more minutes. So the things that help are the support of caring and accepting adults. That's the number one thing. So every study shows us that having access to caring and accepting adults provides the most protection against adverse outcomes. Access to spaces that affirm sexual identity, sexual orientation and gender identity, environments and materials that are accurate, inclusive, and respectful of LGBTQ people, and also LGBTQ people who look like them. So that includes LGBTQ people of color, LGBTQ people who look like the people in the countries that they came from, not just white people. Support in changing name or gender marker legal documents, and freedom from discrimination in policies. These are like the big protective factors. We're going to break that down just a little bit. I might go a little bit fast through some of these because I want time to answer your questions. And so, so pronouns. I know people earlier talked about pronouns. There are many different pronouns that youth are using. I do not know all of the pronouns. I know that ze, zay, zers is one set of pronouns. Sometimes people use a pronoun if they, she, or they. I like to use the pronoun they because I feel like that really, for me now anyway, feels like, okay, well, I've never felt like I was in the binary, but I've always grown up using she, but they is a way for me to express it. I don't feel necessarily like I'm part of that binary, and maybe someday I'll use a different pronoun altogether. So one of the things that is a protective factor is having pronouns respected by the people that you live with and the people who you spend time with. It is very important. It's about our identity. And when people refuse to use a person's pronouns that they are asking you to use, it is very painful, and it feels like they're being dismissed, they're being devalued, they're not being seen. And also it's a statement that, that you're not really who you are. That term is called misgendering. And when we misgender people and we make our assumptions about pronouns based on, how a person looks and what their voice might sound like, we are demonstrating that you have to look a certain way to demonstrate your gender. And that is not the case for many people. So we cannot and should not ever assume we know someone's gender just from knowing their name, seeing their face or body, or hearing their voice. By sharing our own pronouns, asking and using the pronouns people ask us to use, we are respecting everyone's identity. Somebody asked the question, I'm gonna answer the question about, actually, I'm gonna come back to this and answer this question when I'm finished with my slides. And this is about a question that said, trying to talk to youth who are LGBT in a way that is sensitive and supportive for them when they haven't felt safe about that. And the same thing goes with pronouns. And I'm going to get back to that so I can just get through the slides and then not just have you looking at a slide. So there are some do's and don'ts. Don't make assumptions about the pronouns a person uses. Do ask others for their name and pronouns when safe to do so. Do use the correct pronouns each time you refer to them. Do not reveal someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, and firm pronouns in front of others without their permission. And if you make a mistake, which happens, acknowledge the mistake, give a brief and sincere apology, and move on. Family members, I'm going to talk real quick about family members. They also need the time to access support and adjust to this information when a youth comes out to them. And sometimes they may need to have individual support. In Houston, we have PFLAG Houston and Gender Infinity. And these two are my favorite go-tos here. PFLAG meets online, I think 3 Sundays a month. And then on the second Sunday of every month, it meets in person here at the Montrose Center at 2:00 in the afternoon. And the best things that we can do for families is connect into these resources. Gender Infinity is also another great resource where youth can get resources and information. They used to have a summer camp and other supports for parents, and it's genderinfinity.com. And again, I will send you all these resources in the end. It's important that we remember to keep telling children that they are loved, that it may be a learning process, but we should never tell someone that's just a phase. There is no cure. Nothing is broken. It's just a time for everybody to be able to get over their misconceptions and to learn to celebrate this child as who they are. And if a youth is rejected by their family, there are so many great resources that can step in and role models that can step in to support these youth. I'm going to pass that one. This is one of the articles, and that has a great glossary. I'm going to send you this glossary in the end. I have a couple of other glossaries that I'm going to send you. So there's so much out there. We're really good at creating graphics, and there's so many great glossaries and other supports out there, which I will make sure you have. And then there's many resources in Spanish, which I have links to here, and I'll send you the links to all of this. And all of these are for people who speak Spanish, both for the individuals themselves and for families. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can answer some questions that people put in the chat or in the Q&A. So we have enough time. And then if I have time to go back, I'll share some more slides with you. So one question was how to help I stop reading questions and go to the ones that you had provided in the beginning. So one of the questions was related to being sensitive, and how do you ask these questions in a sensitive way? So here's the way that I look at this. First of all, if we start out and create an environment where we normalize asking these questions, then it makes the space safer. So first is, what does your office space look like? What does your workspace look like? Do you have rainbow images? Do you have images that look like these immigrant youth as well? Do you have signage that shows that this is a welcoming space? That's the first part. Then, do you have your pronouns on? Maybe you have your name placard on your desk that says, my name is Miss Smith, and my pronouns are she, they, and that you have there on your desk as a way to get that conversation started. And if somebody asks you, why do you have that? Then you have an opportunity for a teaching moment. So you're setting a stage where asking these questions is really just a part of the process. Because really we should be asking people, what is your sexual orientation and what is your gender identity? And there are definitely ways to do that that may be more sensitive than others. So I'm trying to keep the here we go. So, but the first thing to recognize is our own bias and our own fear of asking these questions. And this is what I would like to address. So if somebody's coming to you and telling you a story and they maybe they are beating around the bush in some spaces or not giving you all the information, then it's really important that you do ask, and you ask in a way that invites them to tell you that information. So tell me about your gender. Tell me about how you like to express yourself. I consider, and, we talk about, if we're social workers, of course, we're always talking about, keeping things, having boundaries. But these things may be really important to helping other youth. Is I identify in this way. How do you identify? Do you have any girlfriends, boyfriends, others that you like? And so my story about this is, if you're afraid to ask somebody about who they like, if they're gay, straight, pan, lesbian, whatever, if we're afraid to ask them because we fear we might be offending them, then I think it's time for us to look at ourselves and realize that we're putting that out there by thinking that. If you are assuming there's absolutely nothing wrong with being gay or lesbian or pan or queer, then it's like asking somebody, what color eyes do they have? Like, are they green or hazel? I can't tell. How tall are you? What's your sexual orientation? And we need to normalize it, because if we're not asking them because we're afraid we're gonna offend somebody, then we're actually thinking that there's something wrong with it. So first is we have to start with ourselves and say, it's a normal question. And if somebody's afraid of answering it, you can say, this is really important information, and this is needed so that I can help you, and this is a safe space. But first, you have to set that environment first so that they can see that it's a safe space, and use language and introduce yourself using your own pronouns. So you start that conversation that way, and you can do it. And if you do it with everybody, then you normalize it. And I think that's really important. Okay, I see so many questions. Okay, youth-friendly material to support youth grappling with complexities of identity. Yes, I think it's called YouTube and TikTok. There's so much out there. There's some great resources. Gender Spectrum is one of my favorites. That's a national one. The Trevor Project, PFLAG, HRC, and those are some really, really good ones, but there are more. These are large national organizations, but you can find this information. But I would say Gender Spectrum is really a great one for gender, exploring, understanding gender identity. PFLAG, Planned Parenthood has really, really good. Here, I can share my screen again and I can do this. Here, I'm going to do this instead so that you can see. I'm going to hang on one second. So I think we can pin my face. So then you can just see me talking. Okay, so those materials are out there, and I'd be happy to send specific resources to anybody at any time. I see this question: how to provide gender affirming healthcare and properly meet personal needs of every patient for our clients that need healthcare. Oh my gosh. Well, if they don't have health insurance, this is obviously a problem, and it makes things very difficult. So I would first start with helping people access the basic health insurance that they need. And they can get a gold card. They can, if they don't have health insurance. There's something called a gold card. They can also go to one of the clinics that are that are around the city that provide healthcare to everybody, regardless of ability to pay and regardless of insurance and regardless of immigration status. And in terms of having gender affirming care, the Montrose Center does provide gender affirming care and also provides therapy, and it provides that on a sliding scale. Of course, there's a wait list for these things. I think one of the hardest things is providing those things for youth who do not have insurance. And unfortunately, I don't have answers. And unfortunately, that can cause lots of problems for some young people and adults who seek some of those medical treatments outside of medical settings and in other ways. Let's see. So why, I'm trying to get through all these. Okay. Why is it important to categorize, name every spectrum? Well, I certainly didn't get a chance to do that. And it says, I think we're working too hard on putting labels to everyone, or are we aiming to find community visibility? Yes, I think it's the latter. So I think people really, especially young people, I see them like, they really want to identify who they are and they want their labels to fit. Yes, I can. Here, I'll go back to the do's and don'ts slide. They want their labels to fit. Sorry. Oops. I'll keep these slides up for you for a minute. Here's one of them. So in terms of identity, people really want their labels to fit who they are. Identity is really important. And if you are not, if you're cisgender, which means you're not any of these other gender identities, or if you're heterosexual, then you've been basically forced to be invisible your whole life or until you can come out. And it's a way to find other people who are like you and to become visible and seen and heard. And that's really important. And you know, a lot of people who aren't gay or who aren't LGBT, a lot of people who aren't LGBT, you know, they don't think about this. They just grow up their lives thinking, they don't even think about it. It's not something you worry about. So it is really important, and especially important for young people, and important for us to allow people to identify themselves as who they are and also to honor that identity. Okay, during legal screenings, how can we signal Central American children that are allies when they don't have any knowledge? Yes. So I would definitely utilize some of the resources that I'm going to provide on language. And I think obviously it's really important this is where I would say we have to have people who are Central American LGBTQ folks that's where your knowledge is going to be for that. You know, I can't answer this question, but I can tell you that the knowledge is there, and it's with people who are from Central America or any of these countries where these youth are coming from, who can tell you, this is how we have this discussion in this culture, or this is how we can talk about this, and here's some words that we can use. That is my best answer for that. I wouldn't attempt to speak, that I have that answer. But I can tell you that that's where we have to go for all of our answers, is to, the people with the lived experience. And if you work for an agency, what I would say is create an opportunity to engage members of those communities in creating the spaces and the language and the materials that you use to help these young people out. I hope that's an understandable answer to that question. When working with children, what are good ways to ask about sexual orientation? I would say, one is, do you like boys? Do you like girls? Do you like both? Do you like neither? Who do you like? And if they say to you, well, why are you asking me that? And you'd say, well, I ask everybody because I don't make any assumptions. I don't know until I ask you. And there are there are boys who like boys and girls who like girls, and there's boys who like both and girls who like both, and there are people who don't identify. I think it's just being real and using language and words that are age appropriate, and asking these questions in ways that just normalize them and just make them okay questions. And again, if somebody says, well, why are you asking? You say, I ask everybody. And it's a way for you to say, a way for you to say, this is okay. This is place it's safe to talk about these things. Somebody said, I often say in the future, if you were to date or marry someone, would you like to marry or date a man, woman, both, or any individual? Or none. So I think that's cute. I think that it makes some assumptions about dating and marrying. And a lot of people, don't even conceive of dating. And I mean, young people, like I know when I was younger, like the idea was so foreign to me. But I like the idea of what you're saying. It's like giving them the option to share with you what their future would look like and who would be in it, if anybody. Some people might say, I don't know. And that would be, and that's okay too. And that gives you information and you can ask more questions. But I like that about saying that in the future, if you were to date or marry someone, but it assumes dating and marrying is part of this person's picture of the future, which isn't always the case. Okay, let's going on to some questions. How can we best support youth rejected by their family? Help them find other resources and supports. Get them connected to the Montrose Center Hatch Youth Program and the Hatch Youth Groups. Help them get into their Gender and Sexuality Alliance or other clubs at their schools. Find out if there are other groups that they can attend. Montrose Center has a lot of groups for youth. We have our groups for youth who are, I don't want to run out of time here. We have a few more minutes. We have groups for youth between the ages of 7 and 20, our Hatch Youth Groups, and they're free and they're open to any LGBTQIA plus youth, and they can just drop in on a Friday night, or they can contact us for an intake and come to one of our online groups. Our Hatch Junior group, somebody had asked, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to a different slide so they can have the do's and don'ts. So sorry about that. Okay, there's the do's and don'ts slide. Going back to, and be supportive of them. And also in terms of youth coming out and having non-supportive families, there's some of the resources I've given to you will be helpful, that I'll be giving to you will be helpful. And also, there's an organization that's called Family Acceptance Project. There are others, but one that have done work on helping families become more accepting. And so one of the slides I wanted to share has to do with that. And I'll go to it. Oh, did I miss it?
Yeah, and we'll be providing resources as well. And if for some reason we miss a question, we'll make sure we are going to download all the questions. And if we miss one, we'll make sure that it gets answered at some point. So.
Let's see. Can anyone try the languages say what their pronouns are in Spanish? I think that you'll find there are some really great glossaries. I will send those to you, and some of them have all of that information. Also, Planned Parenthood, PFLAG, the National Planned Parenthood, PFLAG, and HRC, which is the Human Resources Campaign, all have Spanish language resources. And so and then it gets a little tricky with the pronouns, and of course, language. Yes, the language is a tricky thing, and it's a tricky part of this. And I told Marissa next year we're going to have some youth with lived experience to be part of this presentation, so they can tell you their stories and talk about their resources and share their understanding of these. So it's not just this full white lady. Yes, clients for Montrose Center. Well, I do believe we're still doing some online counseling. The best thing to do is to go to our website and montrosecenter.org and look under counseling services, and there's a link there for signing up for counseling. Also, our youth groups are available online 2 nights a week. So if youth want to come online, they can just send me a email at info@hatchyouth.org. And I'm going through these fast. I think, is there anything really big that I missed that somebody wants me to get back to? HIV resources. Yes, there are resources for youth, especially if they're 18 and over, here at the Montrose Center. Well, even if they're not, but there are a lot of resources for HIV positive youth here through the Montrose Center. So you should refer them to us.
Okay. Well, thank you, Laura. I don't want to cut you off. We are running out of time, but I'll make sure that we go through every single question. If we miss one, I'll make sure that I send that information to them. Let me see if I attempt again to share my screen so we could end the, okay, let me see. Thank you so much. I apologize. Okay. Okay, where are we at? Sorry, my Zoom is acting up. I hope hold on. Sorry, I can't see anything. I'm lost. I apologize, everybody. My Zoom is acting up. Okay. Laura, can you see my slides or the presenter?
Yes, it says, please don't forget to complete the survey for feedback.
Okay, perfect. So yes, please don't forget to do that. This is going to help us for future trainings to learn what we did right and maybe where we could improve. Also, if you could give us ideas of future webinars or training ideas, we'll take those into consideration. We'll also provided, I think we dropped the link to if you need a letter of attendance, if you need to request that, make sure that you fill that out. Okay. I want to encourage everyone. Okay, I think they're looking at my notes. Sorry, my Zoom is acting up, so there's nothing in my notes that I'm hiding. So visit our resources center in our website. These are just a few of our resources. I'll provide a copy of the presentation that includes all the links to this. I don't know why you guys are seeing all this, but okay. So we encourage everyone to follow us on social media. You could keep up with all our trainings, webinars, and any resources that come up. Please follow us. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Okay, and thank you so much, everyone. I'm gonna stop sharing. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Laura, for being our guest speaker. You were great, and we hope to have this again next year. If for some reason we missed your question, we did not ignore you, we apologize. We'll make sure that you get your question answered. We'll send them via email. We'll send a bunch of resources, both in Spanish and English, and we'll provide your answer to your question. Thank you so much. And
thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.
Yes. Bye, everybody. Have a great, great afternoon. And thank you again, Laura.
Thanks. My pleasure. My honor. Thanks for having me. Muchas gracias.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for being an ally. Thank you. Bye-bye.